The Poet, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I am not much interested in the celebrated, and I have never had patience with the passion that afflicts so many to shake hands with the great ones of the earth. When it is proposed to me to meet some person distinguished above his fellows by his rank or his attainments, I seek for a civil excuse that may enable me to avoid the honour, and when my friend Diego Torre suggested giving me an introduction to Santa Anna, I declined. But for once the excuse I made was sincere. Santa Anna was not only a great poet, but also a romantic figure, and it would have amused me to see in his decrepitude a man whose adventures, in Spain at least, were legendary. But I knew that he was old and ill, and I could not believe that it would be anything but a nuisance to him to meet a stranger and a foreigner. Callisto de Santa Anna was the last descendant of the Grand School. In a world unsympathetic to Byronism, he had led a Byronic existence, and he had narrated his hazardous life in a series of poems that had brought him a fame unknown to his contemporaries. I am no judge of their value, for I read them first when I was 23 and then was enraptured by them. They had a passion, a heroic arrogance, and a multicoloured vitality that swept me off my feet, and to this day, so intermingled are those ringing lines and haunting cadences with the charming memories of my youth, I cannot read them without a beating heart. I am inclined to think that Callisto de Santa Anna deserves the reputation he enjoys among the Spanish-speaking peoples. In those days, his verses were on the lips of all young men, and my friends would talk to me endlessly of his wild ways, his vehement speeches, for he was a politician as well as a poet, his incisive wit, and his amours. He was a rebel and sometimes an outlaw, daring and adventurous, but above all, he was a lover. We knew all about his passion for this great actress or that divine singer, had we not read till we knew them by heart the burning sonnets in which he described his love, his anguish, and his wrath. And we were aware that an infanta of Spain, the proudest descendant of the Bourbons, having yielded to his entreaties, had taken the veil when he ceased to love her. When the Philips, her royal ancestors, tired of a mistress, she entered a convent, for it was unfitting that one whom the king had loved should be loved by another, and was not Callisto de Santa Anna greater than any earthly king? We applauded the lady's romantic gesture. It was creditable to her and flattering to our poet. But all this took place many years ago, and for a quarter of a century, Don Callisto, disdainfully withdrawing from a world that had nothing more to offer, had lived in seclusion in his native town of Asilla. It was when I announced my intention of going there. I had been spending a week or two in Seville, not because of him, but because it is a charming little Andalusian town with associations that endear it to me, that Diego Torre offered me this introduction. It appeared that Don Callisto allowed the younger men of letters occasionally to visit him, and now and then would talk to them with the fire that had electrified his hearers in the great days of his prime. "What does he look like now?" I asked. "Magnificent. Have you a photograph of him?" "I wish I had. He has refused to face the camera since he was 35. He says he does not wish posterity to know him other than young." I confess that I found this suggestion of vanity not a little touching. I knew that in early manhood he was of extraordinary beauty, and that moving sonnet of his written when he grew conscious that youth had forever left him shows with what a bitter and sardonic pang he must have watched the passing of those looks that had been so fantastically admired. But I refused my friend's offer. I was quite satisfied to read once more the poems I had known so well, and for the rest I preferred to wander about the silent and sun-swept streets of Asilla in freedom. It was with some consternation, therefore, that on the evening of my arrival I received a note from the great man himself. Diego Torre had written to him of my visit, he said, and it would give him great pleasure if I would call on him at 11 next morning. In the circumstances, there was nothing for me to do but to present myself at his house at the appointed hour. My hotel was in the plaza, and on that spring morning it was animated. But as soon as I left it, I might have walked in a deserted city. The streets, the tortuous white streets, were empty, but for a woman in black now and then who returned with measured steps from her devotions. Esilla is a town of churches, and you can seldom go far without seeing a crumbling facade or a tower in which storks have built their nests. Once I paused to watch a string of little donkeys pass by. Their red caparisons were faded, and they carried I know not what in their panniers. But Esilla has been a place of consequence in its day, and many of these white houses have gateways of stone surmounted by imposing coats of arms. For to this remote spot flowed the riches of the New World, and adventurers who had gathered wealth in the Americas spent here their declining years. It was in one of these houses that Don Callisto lived, and as I stood at the reja after pulling the bell, I was pleased to think that he lived in such a fitting style. There was a dilapidated grandeur about the massive gateway that suited my impression of the flamboyant poet. Though I heard the bell peal through the house, no one answered it, and I rang a second, and then a third time. At last an old woman with a heavy moustache came to the gate. "What do you want?" she said. She had fine black eyes, but a sullen look, and I supposed that it was she who took care of the old man. I gave her my card. "I have an appointment with your master." She opened the iron gateway and bade me enter. Asking me to wait, she left me and went upstairs. The patio was pleasantly cool after the street. Its proportions were noble, and you surmised that it had been built by some follower of the conquistadors. But the paint was tarnished, the tiles on the floor broken, and here and there great flakes of plaster had fallen away. There was about everything an air of poverty, but not of squalor. I knew that Don Callisto was poor. Money had come to him easily at times, but he had never attached any importance to it, and had spent it profusely. It was plain that he lived now in a penury that he disdained to notice. In the middle of the patio was a table with a rocking chair on each side of it, and on the table newspapers a fortnight old. I wondered what dreams occupied his fancy as he sat there on the warm summer nights, smoking cigarettes. On the walls under the colonnade were Spanish pictures, dark and bad, and here and there stood an ancient dusty bargueño, and on it a mended lustre plate. By the side of a door hung a pair of old pistols, and I had a pleasant fancy that they were the weapons he had used when in the most celebrated of his many duels, for the sake of Pepa Montanez the dancer, now I suppose a toothless and raddled hag, he had killed the Duke of Dos Hermanos. The scene, with its associations which I vaguely divined, so aptly fitted the romantic poet that I was overcome by the spirit of the place. Its noble indigence surrounded him with a glory as great as the magnificence of his youth. In him, too, there was the spirit of the old conquistadors, and it was becoming that he should finish his famous life in that ruined and magnificent house. Thus surely should a poet live and die. I had arrived cool enough and even somewhat bored at the prospect of my meeting. But now I began to grow a trifle nervous. I lit a cigarette. I had come at the time appointed and wondered what detained the old man. The silence was strangely disturbing. Ghosts of the past thronged the silent patio, and an age dead and gone gained a sort of shadowy life for me. The men of that day had a passion and a wildness of spirit that are gone out of the world forever. We are no longer capable of their reckless deeds or their theatrical heroics. I heard a sound and my heart beat quickly. I was excited now, and when at last saw him coming slowly down the stairs, I caught my breath. He held my card in his hand. He was a tall old man and exceedingly thin, with a skin the color of old ivory. His hair was abundant and white, but his bushy eyebrows were dark still. They made his great eyes flash with a more somber fire. It was wonderful that at his age those black eyes should still preserve their brilliance. His nose was aquiline, his mouth close set. His unsmiling eyes rested on me as he approached, and there was in them a look of cool appraisal. He was dressed in black, and in one hand held a broad-brimmed hat. There was in his bearing assurance and dignity. He was as I should have wished him to be, and as I watched him, I understood how he had swayed men's minds and touched their hearts. He was every inch a poet. He had reached the patio and came slowly towards me. He had really the eyes of an eagle. It seemed to a tremendous moment, for there he stood, the heir of the great old Spanish poets, the magnificent Herrera, the nostalgic and moving Fray Luis, Juan de la Cruz, the mystic, and the crabbed and obscure Gongora. He was the last of that long line, and he trod in their steps not unworthily. Strangely in my heart sang the lovely and tender song, which is the most famous of Don Callisto's lyrics. I was abashed. It was fortunate for me that I had prepared beforehand the phrase with which I meant to greet him. It is a wonderful honor, maestro, for a foreigner such as I to make the acquaintance of so great a poet. A flicker of amusement passed through those piercing eyes, and a smile for an instant curved the lines of that stern mouth. I am not a poet, senor, but a bristle merchant. You have made a mistake. Don Callisto lives next door. I had come to the wrong house.
The Dream, a short story by Somerset Maugham. It chanced that in August 1917, the work upon which I was then engaged obliged me to go from New York to Petrograd, and I was instructed for safety's sake to travel by way of Vladivostok. I landed there in the morning and passed an idle day as best I could. The Trans-Siberian train was due to start, so far as I remember, at about 9 in the evening. I dined at the station restaurant by myself. It was crowded, and I shared a small table with a man whose appearance entertained me. He was a Russian, a tall fellow, but amazingly stout, and he had so vast a paunch that he was obliged to sit well away from the table. His hands, small for his size, were buried in rolls of fat. His hair, long, dark, and thin, was brushed carefully across his crown in order to conceal his baldness, and his huge, sallow face, with its enormous double chin, clean-shaven, gave you an impression of indecent nakedness. His nose was small, a funny little button upon that mass of flesh, and his black, shining eyes were small too. But he had a large, red, and sensual mouth. He was dressed neatly enough in a black suit. It was not worn, but shabby. It looked as if it had been neither pressed nor brushed since he had had it. The service was bad, and it was almost impossible to attract the attention of a waiter. We soon got into conversation. The Russian spoke good and fluent English. His accent was marked, but not tiresome. He asked me many questions about myself and my plans, which, my occupation at the time making caution necessary, I answered with a show of frankness, but with dissimulation. I told him I was a journalist. He asked me whether I wrote fiction, and when I confessed that in my leisure moments I did, he began to talk of the later Russian novelists. He spoke intelligently. It was plain that he was a man of education. By this time, we had persuaded the waiter to bring us some cabbage soup, and my acquaintance pulled a small bottle of vodka from his pocket, which he invited me to share. I do not know whether it was the vodka or the natural loquaciousness of his race that made him communicative, but presently he told me unasked a good deal about himself. He was of noble birth, it appeared, a lawyer by profession, and a radical. Some trouble with the authorities had made it necessary for him to be much abroad, but now he was on his way home. Business had detained him at Vladivostok, but he expected to start for Moscow in a week, and if I went there, he would be charmed to see me. "Are you married?" he asked me. I did not see what business it was of his, but I told him that I was. He sighed a little. "I am a widower," he said. "My wife was a Swiss, a native of Geneva. She was a very cultivated woman. She spoke English, German, and Italian perfectly. French, of course, was her native tongue. Her Russian was much above the average for a foreigner. She had scarcely the trace of an accent." He called a waiter who was passing with a tray full of dishes and asked him, I suppose, for then I knew hardly any Russian, how much longer we were going to wait for the next course. The waiter, with a rapid but presumably reassuring exclamation, hurried on, and my friend sighed. Since the revolution, the waiting in restaurants has become abominable. He lighted his 20th cigarette, and I, looking at my watch, wondered whether I should get a square meal before it was time for me to start. "My wife was a very remarkable woman," he continued. "She taught languages at one of the best schools for the daughters of noblemen in Petrograd. For a good many years we lived together on perfectly friendly terms. She was, however, of a jealous temperament, and unfortunately, she loved me to distraction." It was difficult for me to keep a straight face. He was one of the ugliest men I had ever seen. There is sometimes a certain charm in the rubicund and jovial fat man, but this saturnine obesity was repulsive. I do not pretend that I was faithful to her. She was not young when I married her, and we had been married for 10 years. She was small and thin, and she had a bad complexion. She had a bitter tongue. She was a woman who suffered from a fury of possession, and she could not bear me to be attracted to anyone but her. She was jealous not only of the women I knew, but of my friends, my cat, and my books. On one occasion in my absence, she gave away a coat of mine merely because I liked none of my coats so well, but I am of an equable temperament. I will not deny that she bored me, but I accepted her acrimonious disposition as an act of God, and no more thought of rebelling against it than I would against bad weather or a cold in the head. I denied her accusations as long as it was possible to deny them, and when it was impossible, I shrugged my shoulders and smoked a cigarette. The constant scenes she made me did not very much affect me. I led my own life. Sometimes, indeed, I wondered whether it was passionate love she felt for me or passionate hate. It seemed to me that love and hate were very near allied. So we might have continued to the end of the chapter if one night a very curious thing had not happened. I was awakened by a piercing scream from my wife. Startled, I asked her what was the matter. She told me that she had had a fearful nightmare. She had dreamt that I was trying to kill her. We lived at the top of a large house, and the well round which the stairs climbed was broad. She had dreamt that just as we had arrived at our own floor, I had caught hold of her and attempted to throw her over the balusters. It was 6 stories to the stone floor at the bottom, and it meant certain death. She was much shaken. I did my best to soothe her, but next morning, and for 2 or 3 days after, she referred to the subject again, and notwithstanding my laughter, I saw that it dwelt in her mind. I could not help thinking of it either, for this dream showed me something that I had never suspected. She thought I hated her. She thought I would gladly be rid of her. She knew, of course, that she was insufferable, and at some time or other the idea had evidently occurred to her that I was capable of murdering her. The thoughts of men are incalculable, and ideas enter our minds that we should be ashamed to confess. Sometimes I had wished that she might run away with a lover, sometimes that a painless and sudden death might give me my freedom. But never, never had the idea come to me that I might deliberately rid myself of an intolerable burden. The dream made an extraordinary impression upon both of us. It frightened my wife, and she became for a little less bitter and more tolerant. But when I walked up the stairs to our apartment, it was impossible for me not to look over the balusters and reflect how easy it would be to do what she had dreamt. The balusters were dangerously low. A quick gesture, and the thing was done. It was hard to put the thought out of my mind. Then some months later, my wife awakened me one night. I was very tired, and I was exasperated. She was white and trembling. She had had the dream again. She burst into tears and asked me if I hated her. I swore by all the saints of the Russian calendar that I loved her. At last she went to sleep again. It was more than I could do. I lay awake. I seemed to see her falling down the well of the stairs, and I heard her shriek and the thud as she struck the stone floor. I could not help shivering. The Russian stopped, and beads of sweat stood on his forehead. He had told the story well and fluently, so that I had listened with attention. There was still some vodka in the bottle. He poured it out and swallowed it at a gulp. "And how did your wife eventually die?" I asked after a pause. And he took out a dirty handkerchief and wiped his forehead. By an extraordinary coincidence, she was found late one night at the bottom of the stairs with her neck broken. Who found her? She was found by one of the lodgers, who came in shortly after the catastrophe. And where were you? I cannot describe the look he gave me of malicious cunning. His little black eyes sparkled. I was spending the evening with a friend of mine. I did not come in till an hour later. At that moment the waiter brought us the dish of meat that we had ordered, and the Russian fell upon it with good appetite. He shoveled the food into his mouth in enormous mouthfuls. I was taken aback. Had he really been telling me in this hardly veiled manner that he had murdered his wife? That obese and sluggish man did not look like a murderer. I could not believe that he would have had the courage. Or was he making a sardonic joke at my expense? In a few minutes it was time for me to go and catch my train. I left him, and I have not seen him since. But I have never been able to make up my mind whether he was serious or jesting.